I want to take some time now to talk about some general assessment tips or considerations or just, things to think about as you begin to, use kind of some of the things that we've talked about in this webinar into your own classrooms and, that assessment planning process, the, choosing which assessment strategies you want to use in your classrooms and how you're going to use that assessment data or feedback to inform your instruction. And so one of the main ones that I can provide you with, and something that really was transformational for me as a teacher, was understanding the difference between knowledge and skill. I think a lot of people use them synonymously when really they're not the same thing. And so don't confuse knowledge and skill. Because just because a student can identify a rhythmic symbol, for instance, that's knowledge. I can have a student, point to a 16th note on a piece of paper. That is knowledge. That does not mean necessarily that the student can apply that knowledge into a performance of some kind. That's the skill, right? To be able to play or sing that note on the paper. That's the skill that we're looking for. And so they're not the same thing. And I just kind of want to drive that point. When I kind of found that out personally, it was, like I was saying, a very transformational moment, because I was like, oh, I'm sitting there quizzing them on knowledge, but I'm not really quizzing them on the skill that it takes to master that standard. And so it's always a good idea to make sure that your assessments are directly connected to the standards, and that when you develop and you're creating and you're facilitating these assessments, that they are created in such a way in which the students are actively using the musical knowledge that you've given them through performance of some kind. That's the skill, right? So assessments really should always be skill-based. Now, that's not to say that you can have knowledge-based assessments, things like diagnostic or some formative assessments where you're kind of tracking whether they understand the basic musical knowledge or concepts. But really, that summative, that final performance or project or whatever you're using in your classroom really should be about using the skills that they've developed through understanding of that musical knowledge. And so the second point I want to talk about is about mediums and modes of assessment. And so in music, there is a plethora of different mediums and modes in which we can use to assess our students. And when I'm talking about mediums, I'm talking about things like, are you going to assess your students using pencil and paper? Are you going to assess your students using body signals, kind of like we talked about earlier with thumbs up, thumbs down, sideways, or numbers, or whatever? Are you going to assess them through technology? Are you going to assess them through performance? And it's kind of the way you are delivering the assessment to your students. That's the kind of thing you can think about. And then the modes is and then the modes, you're talking about kind of the singing, playing instruments, improvising. Are they listening to music? Or are they moving to music, as etc., as an example? And so these can vary greatly between music content area, different grade levels, even between classes in the same grade level, and even from student to student. So don't forget that you can differentiate the assessments that you're creating in your classroom using these different kinds of methods to meet the students where they are. Because one student may, one student may excel with pencil and paper work, whereas another student, that just doesn't work. They can, or maybe a student can't, is apprehensive about that pencil and paper work, but they excel at singing, for instance, and they're still showing the same amount of skill or knowledge, whatever kind of assessment you're doing, they're just doing it in a different way. And so I just kind of want to provide that kind of spark of, oh, well, not every assessment has to be the same or look the same in each grade level, each content area, each from student to student or class to class. And so you can differentiate those assessments to meet the needs of your students. And so really kind of the big question to think about for this part is just how am I, the teacher, allowing my students to show me what they know and being able to do it successfully. I think is an important part of kind of creating and developing those assessments. The third thing I want to talk about is keeping the grading time in mind. The goal is to collect the evidence or the data or the feedback of the student learning. It's not getting burnt out. And for me, I was getting burnt out with assessments. So a lot of the time I was trying to figure out how I was going to get so much assessment data points due to the sheer numbers of students I saw in the shortest amount of time. And so, I think that, obviously it's important to notate where your students are in their learning process, but it just needs to be done in a manageable way. And I wish I could provide you with ways that you could do that, but it really just works and looks differently from teacher to teacher. I know some teachers do it a certain way, some teachers, do it a different way. For me, something that was beneficial was, doing, if I was giving some sort of formative assessment and having students with a thumbs up or thumbs down, for instance, I was only marking down the students who had their thumbs down because it was easier because those numbers were usually smaller that I could say, okay, well, I need to go back and reteach this content or this concept in some way to reach those students who did have their fingers down, and so on and so forth. So that's a way that kind of helped me in my assessment data collection or grading process, for instance, for one type of assessment. And so data takes time to record, but the information that we do get from it is beneficial for us, and it's worth it for us to know where our students are in their learning. And another big thing is, I think a lot of the times we think, oh, assessment is a test. I have to stop everything we're doing and give this test, or give this formative assessment, whatever. But you don't always necessarily have to stop class to assess. You can be assessing in the activities that you plan in your classroom as well. That can look differently. Maybe the assessment happens after school via video, students submitting video, especially now during this kind of time of virtual or digital learning. It just kind of depends on your situation, what's going to work best for you, and how you're best going to do it in a way that is not going to burn you out and you're doing it in a manageable time. So next, I want to just mention, assessment should never embarrass a student. When we plan assessments, we're always trying to set them up for success as opposed to failure. And so when we have an assessment in which a student may feel nervous or anxious about, maybe it's performing a solo in front of their peers, something like that, and they're uncomfortable doing that, more than likely they're going to fail because they're uncomfortable. So how can you actively plan for those instances? Well, in an assessment where you still get to assess the student, but maybe it's just in a different way that sets them up for success. I know a lot of the times in my case, I had students who were afraid to sing alone, and so instead of forcing them to sing alone or embarrassing them through the process of, okay, you need to sing, everybody, we're going to wait here until you sing, like that's not a good kind of method, or you're not really setting that student up for success. So in my case, what I would do is either have the student sing it in my ear, or play it for me after class if it was on an instrument, for instance, or maybe I sing with them, and I'm singing quietly so I can hear them, or maybe they're singing with a peer, so I'm hearing both students at the same time. It just kind of depended on the student and the environment. There's different ways that you can still set up students for success and not embarrass them through the assessment process. And so again, part of that too, the second bullet point there, is just kind of developing that, just a sense of safety in your classroom, through just kind of creating a positive learning environment. That was super important to me as a teacher. and having, teachable moments about why we don't laugh or make comments or about students who are trying to do their best when they're performing and things like that, and just kind of creating that safe space so that they feel comfortable enough to make mistakes, or if they do make mistakes, that they're not worried or fearful of rejection from their fellow peers, excuse me, in the classroom through that assessment. Lastly, assessments are incredibly valuable in the field of music education, but they're also not perfect and they're limited. Assessments can't truly tell us the expanse of what a student does or doesn't know in music. And it really, it can only tell us how well a student performed on that particular assessment that you gave them. And so what I mean by this is that, we should use that feedback or that data that we get from that assessment to ultimately drive our instruction. And so let's say a student really excelled in one assessment. Well, how do we challenge them further past that assessment? Well, can they transfer that knowledge into another form of assessment? Things like that. Or if a student did not quite make, they don't quite understand enough, and you get that feedback from that assessment, then how are you going to use that feedback or that data from that assessment to reteach, kind of like we were talking about earlier in the webinar, to reteach a concept, or to maybe there's some sort of obstacle that they're just not understanding our concept, and how we are going to kind of rework our teaching so that they can be successful in that assessment. So assessments are great. We obviously see the value in assessing our students, but realizing that that is a moment in time of that student's learning, kind of like a snapshot, a picture of their performance in your classroom. And so how are you going to use that snapshot to propel them further into music making, into their music learning, and just general appreciation in music going further from there. And so those are just some general tips that I thought could be beneficial just to kind of think about and ponder as you continue on in your journey in assessment in your own music classroom and in your own music content area. Just take this, kind of reflect on them, and try to implement some of these kind of ideas and assessment concepts into your own music classroom as you move forward.